So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Charles Betts. Today, we are hosting the first of our series of two webinars regarding the Marie Curie individual fellowships. So, as you saw from your invitations, we'll have two parts. This first part will be more about the basics and how to apply, how the administrative parts work, how the different panels work, etc. While the session next week will be about more on really focusing on the grant writing itself. So a few housekeeping things first. You will see from your window, you have a chat option, you have a questions option. We would like you to use the chat in case you have any technical difficulties. Granted, we might not always be able to fix those. While the questions part is where you can really ask questions that you didn't understand or general questions regarding the fellowship. We organize this in a way that we'll probably not cover the questions that you're posing during this session this time, but we'll take our time and discuss them next time in the next session. However, if we do have a little bit of time, we might be able to cover some. So a few other notes. This will be recorded. So the only thing that will be recorded is what you see and hear now and slides. You will have access to these slides later on as well, so you can re-watch the recording, and we'll also send you the slides after the webinar is over. So I think by now you've gotten used to having online and digital webinars. I think we see this as a chance because most of our Marie Curie fellows that want to come to Luxembourg, they are often based outside of Luxembourg, obviously. And we have been organizing for a few years now this series, this not webinar, but really a training session. And this is the first time we do it remotely, and I think it's a big chance for all of you to join in from outside. A very, very, very tiny introduction before we really get into the matter. Who are we? We are Luxinnovation, so we are the Luxembourgish Innovation Agency, dealing mostly with innovative companies, but there is one part of our unit, that's the unit I'm based in, that is covering the European funding. And so we are the national contact point for European funding, mostly Horizon 2020. So Horizon 2020 is the major research framework that the European Commission is financing to finance research all over Europe. There are different calls and different types of funding tools. Some are collaborative, some are based on big, large consortia, some are based on calls, so questions that the Commission is asking to be answered, while others, such notably as the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Actions, they're really meant to be bottom-up. So what that means is they are meant to be open to any sort of ideas from any type of field, as long as they cover research development projects. So the Marie Curie individual fellowships, they're postdoctoral fellowships. So they are meant for, in principle, they're meant for anybody who's finished their PhD and who wants to do a postdoctoral fellowship. Now we'll get into more details on this because it's not exactly this, because even people without a PhD can in principle apply, but it gets a bit more complicated. But an important message is that the Commission is not, the primary goal for the Commission is not really to finance research through these actions, but to finance your, as a researcher, your career development and your mobility. So what does mobility mean? Mobility is a big element of Marie Curie. Mobility means you come from one place, you go to another place, and you bring your expertise from the outside to a local research institute, organization, while the research organization teaches you what they can do. And then afterwards, after these 2-year projects, you go your separate ways. You can maintain your connections, obviously, but both of you benefited from this. It's a win-win. They're financed and managed through the European Commission. That does not mean that the European Commission is personally selecting candidates, evaluating candidates. They leave this up to experts from your field, so just like a peer review publication would do. The experts come from around the world, they're gender neutral, etc. So I think the revision process is something that's fairly transparent. But of course, the Marie Curie, as they are a very interesting way of financing these smaller research fellowships, they're very competitive. So we look very globally, so all applications from all countries, you have around a 15% success rate. That's where we stand. That's something you need to take note of. I have to say that in the 15%, so 15%, there's a certain number of people that just submit last minute. They were not really prepared. They were just asked by their principal investigator 2 weeks before the deadline to write something. So in these 15%, there are a lot of low quality proposals, but still it's very competitive. And I spoke about the bottom-up approach. Some vocabulary, and this will probably there will be much more vocabulary that I haven't explained, or abbreviations and acronyms. That's sort of a condition you get with working with the European Commission. You work with all these lingo, which is not very professional, and if you're not from the field, you might not understand. So please ask, or in most cases, you can just Google the abbreviations and you will find it very easily. But here are some examples. ER, what the Commission is referring to as ER, an experienced researcher, and that is again this definition of either having obtained a PhD, a doctorate, or having 4 years of research experience, and we'll get into that in a separate slide. Then there are different types of participants, right? There is the applicant, let's just call it applicant or candidate, that will wants to do the fellowship, and there's the host. And the host is the organization that is hosting the candidate during the fellowship. There is the beneficiary, and in most cases, the main host is the beneficiary. So the main host is the organization where you stay the longest during your research fellowship. The beneficiary simply means that this is the organization that gets the money from the European Commission, that signs the agreement, the contract with the European Commission, that gets the funding, and then has working contract with you, the research fellow. The beneficiary host, they can be public, they can be private organizations, it can be public administration. So it's a wide range of types of participants there. There's also the so-called partner organizations. So partner organizations in this context, in the context of the individual fellowships, these are organizations that you don't work for directly, that don't host you as a primary hosting situation, but that might be collaborators where you spend some of your time during your fellowship to do a so-called secondment, and then that's the next bullet point. So the partner organizations, let's imagine you stay at University X, and you do 3 months of secondments at a private company. This private company will not be paid directly through this grant. They will not have to sign anything. They don't even have to write anything in the proposal. You still need to provide their details as long as you know them in the proposal, but there's no larger obligation here on them. They're just, hosting you for a limited amount of time. These secondments, and I'll get more into secondments on a separate slide again, they're really meant to complement your research experience. So learning a new technique and then applying it in your main host organization. Then panels. Panels is a tricky definition because there are different types of panels even inside the Marie Curie individual fellowships. On one hand, panels basically means the scientific field that you choose, that your proposal will be evaluated in, let's say economics or life science, chemistry, you name it. So there's a list of, I think, 10 or so different scientific domains, and you need to pick one of them when you submit. Generally, it doesn't really, I mean, of course, it has to be relevant, but with regard to success rates or so, it doesn't really have a big influence which one you choose. As I said, it should be, and if you're doing an interdisciplinary project, it might be tricky, but we can always discuss which panel to choose. It shouldn't be a big problem. There are other types of panels, and we'll get to these again in another slide, that are the different types of actions. So there's the standard individual fellowship, but then there are different other forms that only a subfraction of you might be eligible for, and we'll get into this. Then there is more general, I mean, some of you are junior, postdocs or are just finishing up their PhD studies, so you might not have been doing a lot of grant writing before, which is fine. I mean, that's really, you're still the target audience for these types of calls, even though it's career, it's not scientific age limited, let's say, or age limited for that matter. But so there are these terms that are linked to proposal writing and project management for that matter, that are work packages. So these are how you organize your work basically that you have to do. So you will end up with a handful of work packages. One work package might be, administration and coordination with your PI, your principal investigator. One work package might be communication and dissemination, which are two separate things. One work package might be experiment 1, one work package might be experiment 2, and with experiment here I mean large set of really experiments. It's like the theme, it's not for each individual thing you do, you don't create work packages. Then you subdivide the work packages, but you'll see this during the writing. Milestones, these are elements you also define in your proposal to divide your time. Basically, the milestone are checkpoints in the process of your project that will tell you if you're on the right track. I mean, the commission doesn't expect you to necessarily succeed with what you're trying to do, but they expect you to do the work. And if the experiment doesn't work, well, that's science. Nobody can blame you for it. But you have these checkpoints, and depending on these checkpoints, you might have to adapt your strategy or change your protocols, etc. So milestone might be, after 6 months, my protocol number 1 provides me results or works for the first time. That might be a milestone. Or doesn't work. That's also a milestone. Deliverables, on the other hand, these are more tangible things in the sense that you produce something. A paper is certainly a deliverable, but a model, some code, some prototype, these are all more or less tangible things, even in an abstract kind of sense, that are deliverables. And again, we can discuss this during the actual work, what this is, but your principal investigators will help you as well. So some misconceptions that I want to clarify first. Who's writing the proposal? So, well, there's no absolute answer to this, but I'm speaking about the general way of how it's done, is that the applicant, so the postdoctoral fellow, will write, let's say, 90% of the proposal. And that depends very much on your host organization. So there are some hosts that give you lots of freedom and that just leave you to the proposal and let you write more or less whatever you want. There are some hosts that really expect a very specific output from your project. And of course, they might be more involved in the discussion with you and the proposal writing, depending on which way they choose. But really, the message should be you are doing the most of the proposal writing as an applicant. However, there are some parts, some data, some information that you need from your host organizations. And I'm not only speaking about the main host, but also if you do a secondment somewhere, you need to include information from them, which you might only get while really speaking to them and getting the information from them. And I highly recommend you do this way in advance, because it's always busy towards the end before the deadline, and that's generally the time where people start to think about, oh yeah, I needed this and that information. do this as soon as possible. Then you give your host plenty of time to provide you all the data that you require, and you can develop it into a nice story, because really this information allows you to tailor-write your proposal and show the complementarity between you, your knowledge, and the host. That's an important element. Academia versus private industry. So I mentioned before, individual fellowships. The host can really be from private and public research. It can be small SMEs. It can be larger companies, and anything in between. So this is important to know. Even if your main host is a private company, there's no obligation to involve an academic partner. There's no obligation to produce scientific papers. However, there is, some obligation to produce an output, and an output can be different things. It can be a patent, it can be a pilot, it can be some solution, some service, some algorithm that you develop and describe, and that might not be made publicly available. That's fine, but there should be some output, and it's fine for both academia and private industry. The ideal scenario is always to have a combination of the two. So having a secondment either in the public when you're in private, or in the private when you're in public. But again, there's no obligation for that either. Extensive collaborations, this is very clear. We see this every year again. Marie Curie projects are really not about extensive collaborative projects. It shouldn't involve 5 different organizations that work together for developing something, a prototype, a solution, and people do experiments everywhere. No, it's really about you and the work you do, either here or together, maybe with another organization that helps you in one way or another, and we can discuss this, but it's mostly a more or less single person project. Research versus career development. Most of you will be very good in describing the research project that you want to do and that you will be doing, and that's fine, but it's very easy to neglect the career development part and the training part, which is absolutely essential to describe in a lot of detail. And I don't mean just putting generic, in year 1, I will have some career training, and in year 2, I will have some this and that. No, it needs to be very specific. Every example that you give, you have at least to be able to give an answer if somebody asks you, even if they want, but it will show in the text, asks you, so what do you actually mean by that? What do you mean? Which training will you take? Where do you want to take the training? How long will it take? What will you get out of it? All these elements are very important for your career, but also for your proposal. Past scientific achievements, because the Marie Curie are so competitive, people tend to think, oh, I need to have 5 Nature publications, etc., and all these things, and 20 patents. No, that's really not the case. The Commission cares about the project very much. The project needs to be very good and excellent, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have this fantastic track record. Generally, what the reviewers will be asked to do is take into consideration your past. So if you come from a high-profile lab in, let's say, Oxford or the MIT, people might expect a different publication record than if you come from another type of university that doesn't have this chance of publishing so much and doesn't have these funds to do this type of research. So in theory, at least, they take this into consideration. In practice, it's not always the case. We know this also for peer review, for publications, but that's just the reality that we are facing. And really, second projects, really the Marie Curie are about this one big project that you describe. It can follow separate leads in this one project, but you're not expected to write the proposal and then, get the money for it, and then in the reality, do only spend 70% of your time on this project, and 30% you do work on the project that your boss actually wants you to work on. That's not how it works, and it will show if you cannot dedicate really your time. There are 2 main different types. There's the European fellowships and there's the global fellowships. I won't speak a lot about global fellowships because most of you will be interested in the European fellowships, but I'll still explain what they're about. So the European fellowships, it's what you basically understand from my past communications. It's 12 to 24 months, with some exceptions, even longer fellowship in one of the EU member states or associated countries, AEC. If you don't know what an associated country is, I put the link there, you can follow it up. Basically, it means that some countries that are not member states of the European Union are still full members of all of Horizon 2020, including Marie Curie programs, and will be treated as such. For example, Norway and Switzerland, etc. And so you can look up this list. But I presume that most of you are interested, or at least I hope are interested in coming to Luxembourg anyway, so that shouldn't be the question. Nationalities are open to anybody, so that's good. No need to get into it. Then there are the different sub-panels, and we'll speak again more about these. There's the standard, which is, standard. Society and enterprise, reintegration, and career restart. On the other hand, we have the global fellowship. There's only basically one panel for that. These are up to 3 years total. And so the first 12 to 24 months, you will actually spend in a third country. So third country being every country that's not an associated or a member state. Let's say China, Japan, Canada, US, Australia. These are the most common destinations. And then, so you spend 1 or 2 years there. And then you need to come for 12 months back to the host country, in this case, Luxembourg. The idea being you learn all these exciting things there, you come back to the Luxembourgish host and you teach them what you learned, basically. For this, you need to be a long-term member state or associated country resident. Again, we can discuss in detail what that means. In this case, the mobility rule, and I will explain you later what the mobility rule means, applies to the third country. So you cannot have lived or resided in this country for a certain amount of time before your project starts. Meaning it's not, for an American citizen to stay in the US and then come back to Europe. And in this is the only case where the partner organization plays a much larger role because of obviously they host them for 12 to 24 months and they need to write a letter of commitment, which is not the case for the individual fellowship, the European fellowship, let's say. Okay, so I told you what the thematic panels are. So these are the scientific disciplines, chemistry, SSH, these are social sciences and humanities, etc. Then there are different separate forms, which some of you might be eligible for, some of you won't. Most importantly, there's a society and enterprise panel. This is for all non-academic host organizations. So if you as a candidate apply to a non-academic host, and non-academic host means not a university, not a public research center, but really like an NGO, or in most cases, a company. You can apply and you should apply for this panel. The reason why I'm telling this is that it's one of the panels that has the highest success rate. So it's significantly higher. So if you stay for your main host at a private company, choose this panel. And here the mobility rule is slightly different. The standard mobility rule is you cannot have lived or worked for more than 12 months in the 3 years, preceding the call deadline. We're always referring to the call deadline, which will be September 9th in this case. Here, the mobility rule is you cannot have lived or worked for longer than 3 years in the past 5 years preceding the call deadline in the country, in this case, Luxembourg. The reintegration panel, this is meant for people that, sorry, I forgot to add more details here in the slide. It's meant for people that are outside of Europe, outside of the EU member state or associated countries, but that are in principle long-term residents of Europe and that want to come back to Europe. And you can see there's a different mobility rule there as well. There's the career restart. Rarely we see candidates that fit into this, but it's an interesting option because these fellowships can last up to 3 years. These are the only ones, apart from the global fellowships. And they are really meant if you had a long career break, and long means at least 12 months within the 18 months immediately preceding the call. And it can be for various reasons, and it's actually really very open. It means any non-research activities, different jobs that you had, even teaching in principle is not research, or in most cases it's parental leave, maternity leave, or unemployment, etc. Then there's the Widening Fellowship, which I will get into because Luxembourg is still, as of this year, a widening country. The only thing you need to know is during the submission, there will be a question that will say, do you want to opt in to the Widening Fellowships? And you should, by all means, say yes. What it really means is that if your proposal was very good, but unfortunately wasn't high enough to really be funded through any of the panels that you chose, there's sort of a backup list. And this is the so-called widening list, because Luxembourg is a widening country. We won't get into the reasons why, because that will take another presentation. But it's basically a backup list that you might still get funded through this list. The only downside basically is that you will not officially be called a Marie Curie Fellow. It will not be a Marie Curie Fellowship, but it will be a widening fellowship, and all the payments, etc. This is the same. So I think it's a win-win. Okay, so I mentioned the general mobility rule. So that's really the 12 months in the 3 years preceding the call deadline. And what it means is you cannot, if we stay with Luxembourg, you want to come to Luxembourg, you cannot have worked or lived here in Luxembourg for more than 12 months in the 3 years preceding the call deadline, again, September 9, 2020. Now, this means, this generally refers to actually physical presence. What do I mean with that? Let's imagine you have a working contract with whatever, the University of Luxembourg, but in reality, because of whatever reasons, you were, during all this time, you were in China for your research. So your actual residence and workplace was China. So you would still be eligible. Or let's imagine you are Luxembourgish, you went to some other country to do your studies, you were still somehow registered in Luxembourg, but not actually physically living here, you would still be eligible for this. Okay. And you know, if you have questions, we can discuss them later, and you can send me emails, etc. The career stage. So this is important, and we often get it's confusing. And I know all the COVID situation doesn't make it easier, but the easiest solution, of course, is if you have defended your PhD by the date of the deadline. So defended, obviously successfully defended. You don't generally need a physical proof, or let's say a physical diploma yet, because in some countries that actually takes a lot of time after your defense, but you need to have defended, and you need to be able to prove it with some official letter or from the university generally. Alternatively, there's the 4 years of full-time research equivalent. So what does that mean? So first of all, well, 4 years of full-time research. Full-time generally means more or less 40 hours per week, depends on the country where you're living. Full-time research means, or the equivalent of that means that if you did only 50% research and 50% whatever, training, teaching, I don't know what, only these 50% will be counted. So that's important. What is research? It's again not always easy to define, but like teaching is not research. And then, you know, we get into the smaller details, and we have to discuss it on a day-to-day or on a personal basis, I guess. And what's important is this gets counted after the degree, after obtaining the degree that allows you to do doctoral training or doctoral degree or PhD. In most cases, that is a master's degree, so you need to count starting your master's degree. But in some cases, like the UK and other countries, you can actually do your PhD or joint master's PhD degree after finishing your bachelor's, and so you count from the date where you obtained your bachelor's degree. And again, contact me if you need help. Collaboration. So we spoke about secondments or these research stays. They can only be in EU member states or associated countries. So they don't have to be in Luxembourg. Sometimes it's easier, but they don't have to. They should be beneficial, obviously, to the researcher and the project. So it's not to make holidays in some fancy location. You list them in the part A of the proposal. So the part A is not the template that you generally will download or see, but it's it's a part that you fill out online. It's mostly information that your host organization actually needs to fill out. So you will need help there. And you can get an idea from the guide for applicants that I link somewhere, to get an idea what kind of information you need to provide, but you need to list them there. There is the possibility, imagine you want to, do a secondment in an academic lab that does research on machine learning in whatever. Then you can describe, and for whatever reasons, you haven't found a partner lab that has agreed. You can then describe everything that you want to do there and everything they need to fulfill, and just hope it gets taken into account, even if you haven't identified them. But obviously, the ideal situation is you have identified them. It can be more than one secondment, more than one different place that you go to. It's up to 6 months total if you do a 2-year fellowship. It's up to 3 months if you do less than 18 months fellowship. And it can be in one piece, it can be in many different pieces, whatever really works best for the project. It should make sense again. As I said, there's no letter of commitment necessary. It's highly recommended to do it intersectoral, meaning if you're staying at a private company, it's nice to have an academic partner and vice versa. But again, whatever makes more sense is the important thing. You need to distinguish it here from short visits. And again, there's no golden formula what is a short visit, but it's generally if you go for 2 or 3 days to some other country, and in this case it can be non-Europe, to collect data, to attend a conference, to speak to a famous researcher, that is not a secondment. That's really a short visit. Because this person will not be supervising you, you will not spend a lot of time there. But again, then we can stretch what exactly is, how long can it be, etc. So it can get very complicated, but let's say general for now. Budget and salary, of course, that's something that's very important for you, for the applicants. How much will you earn? And I cannot give you a straight answer to that, and then I explain why. But in terms of budget, in principle, it's calculated very easily. There is a single budget that the commission will pay to your host, and the host will pay to you as a salary. So part of this, what the host gets is this living allowance. So that's really your salary, and it's a fixed amount. It's for these 4,880 euros per month. There's a mobility allowance, which you'll get in any case as well. These are really to cover your costs related to, staying in, finding an apartment, renting, moving, etc. But you don't need to keep any proof of this, right? For what you spend your money, you just get it basically as a salary. Now there are some countries, and I never heard of Luxembourg that this would be the case, but some countries actually tax the living allowance, so the salary different to the mobility allowance. So you might have to check with the accounting of your host on an answer on this, but my general impression is that it will just be treated and taxed like salary. So another very important point that I forgot to mention is these amounts that you see, they are before subtracting the employer cost and before subtracting taxes. So the actual amount will be lower. Then there is the family allowance, which you will only be paid if you need to take care of a family. And what this means is at the date of the submission, so the September 9th, you either need to be married or have an equivalent legally defined type of partnership, or you need to have dependent children that are financed through you, that you take care of. Now, the thing is, this will not be reevaluated during the course. So if you get married the day after the submission deadline, you will not get this money. If you get divorced the day after the submission deadline, you will keep the family allowance. Okay. just to say, not to give you any life tips, but just that you know. Another part of this budget that the research organization, the host, gets paid is covering the research costs. So, consumables, equipment, all these things. Training, if you go to courses, if you go to conferences, etc. Networking, same thing. You go to conferences or you go to other places. You tell them about your work. They tell you about theirs. But also, for example, if you go on a secondment and you need to go to whatever, the UK, and life there is very expensive, part of this accommodation for this limited amount of time can be covered through this budget. And this budget is 800 euros per month. Then there is the management and indirect costs, which is 650 euros. This is really just an amount that your host gets paid and can, in principle, do whatever they want with it. They don't even have to spend it on the action in principle, because they will not be audited for this. Generally, this money is used for everyday electricity and providing you an office space and all these things. So these are indirect costs. What's important is that for these last 2 points, if your host sees that they don't need all this amount to cover these costs, they are not obliged to use a part of it to pay you a top up to increase your salary. They can do this, but it's really up to them. And generally, I would say for the research costs, it's not a good idea to subtract a whole lot of money and increase your salary, because it will mean that you will get less training. But of course, there are some types of research that need more or less money. So it depends really on case to case. There is, in theory, a country correction coefficient for the whole thing, but for Luxembourg, that's basically 1, so we don't need to speak about it. There are other countries where this is higher than 1, and then you get paid slightly higher. I can dedicate another whole 2 hours on the reasons why this is 1 for Luxembourg, and might not reflect the living costs, but it is what it is. The salary can also be topped up by different other sources. If the company or the university or whomever decides to just pay you more, that's fine. They can do this. So as I said, the taxation and the employer costs will be subtracted. So I cannot give you an exact number, because, for example, the taxation will depend on your family status and on many different factors that I have no idea about, and no reason to know. You can say if you have a family, and more or less you might end up with something around 3,500 to 4,000 a month, but really don't quote me on that, because it can change depending on many different factors. But that's a ballpark figure. And I have to say, even though, yes, Luxembourg is an expensive country, but I think this amount is easily doable to live in Luxembourg and work here. And it's even better if, like many people do, because Luxembourg is such a small country, you commute from neighboring France, Germany, or Belgium, meaning you live there and you come to Luxembourg to work, because the living costs there will be significantly lower. But then you need to have public transport, etc. Which, by the way, inside Luxembourg is for free, free public transport. Yay. Okay, so moving on. Quickly about the evaluation process. You can read about this in more detail later on. I will also link where I took the document where I took this figure out. But just to go quickly over it, once the call is closed, the deadline is over. The REA, which is the Research Executive Agency from the European Commission, is just looking if everything is in order, if you're eligible, if whatever, it's not a double submission, or you don't have a PhD, but you said you have a PhD, etc. They do this, and then together with the vice chairs, they will select generally 3, but can be more, external experts, evaluators from your field of experience. Now, some of them will be obviously experts in exactly what you do. Some of them will be more remotely from your area, especially if you're doing interdisciplinary work. They will first remotely evaluate and then write a small report, submit it, and then discuss it basically together and discuss, try to find a consensus. There will be, further external people than these three that will write up a report. This will be discussed, blah, blah, blah. It's a long process, but in theory, at least, it's very fair and transparent. As I said, you can read about it more in detail, but I think in the end, it doesn't really matter so much. What matters to you is that it's the evaluators, and what matters is, of course, the criteria that they evaluate your proposal on. Now, I'm not saying that every evaluator is completely neutral and thinks you're the best researcher in the world. We know this from peer review. That's just the reality of how life in science is. And I'm not saying it's ideal, but it's fairly transparent and it's fairly neutral as much as possible. And maybe this whole process of evaluation is changed this year a bit because the Commission, due to COVID, obviously also is moving more and more to remote meetings and discussions between reviewers. What you will care about, of course, are the evaluation criteria. And so there are 3 main criteria. 50% of it is based on the excellence, and we can discuss in more detail what that means. 30% is the impact. So what kind of impact will your outcome have on society, on industry, on patients, on citizens, you name it, but it should have an output that's tangible by somebody. You don't do it just for fun, right? And then 20% is implementation. What that means is how you structure and organize your work. And that might be something, the last 2 parts are maybe a bit more unusual for you because you might not be used to thinking so much about this. But that is certainly something that you might require a bit more help during the proposal writing, thinking along these lines. And again, here I listed some. This is actually taken from a guidebook that is given to the evaluator. So you don't get better information than that. And in the next slide, I give the link to this document so you can look at it yourself. I highly recommend reading it. But we'll also discuss this more in detail in the next session. What you should write where, etc. This is just a continuation of this. I won't get into the details. Here is the link to this document. So I mostly recommend 3 documents that you need to take into account. One is the guide for applicants. So this is and the link is somewhere in the slides that you'll get. This is the official guidelines of the Commission with the definitions, etc. Second is the Net for Mobility handbook. So that's a guideline book written by people like me, national contact points that looked at their own experience and the questions that came up in the past and best practice, etc. I really, really recommend you to follow that and follow the guidelines because it's very valuable information and it will help you a lot to structure your ideas. And then the third one is this document. And then later on, during the proposal, when you're more advanced in the proposal writing, you can ask for more documents and you can look for them yourself. Most of them are publicly available. For example, on communication itself or on IP or all these small little things that you generally don't think about, but other people have done this a lot. So you can just use their best practices for you, and it will make a big difference. How does the submission itself technically work? So you go to the call website, there's a link on the slide there. You click on the Start Submission button. I know that sounds very scary, but trust me, you can do it. Of course, you select one of these different types of actions that we spoke about before, these different panels, the standard mostly applying to most of you, I guess, or the society and enterprise, but depending on the case, it can be the others. Then if you don't have an EU account, you will be asked to do so. It's an easy process, be done quite fast. And then you get into the more, well, commission portal, where you can download the actual template. So that's the blue box below. It says download Part B template. There's really the document that you can fill out down the PDF with the template, which is very basic. It's basically just giving you these main criteria that we discussed before. But again, I recommend supplementing this with the information that we'll discuss in the next session on how to substructure the different points. The Part A is online. You can already start together with your host filling in these details as soon as possible. That's, you know, information about the name of the host, etc. If they already have an account, a EU account, etc. All these kinds of information. And then what I recommend, it's also scary, but you can submit as soon as you upload your proposal, what you filled in, you can submit this. And I know it sounds very scary, but what happens is it's basically just saved on the server, and that's it. It's sort of an online backup of your proposal. And once you write version 1.2, you upload it again, and the first version will be replaced with the new one. So this is highly recommended because it's basically an online backup, and especially once we get to the end of the proposal, of the deadline, towards the deadline, what will happen is, and the last deadline, so 1 year ago, there were just short of 10,000 people that submitted in the same time. So you can imagine any sort of IT system is prone to crashing when that happens. And in theory, at least, the commission is, through crashing of servers, you will not be able to submit. It will be your fault, so you cannot submit afterwards then. At least that's the official statement from the commission. So I recommend submitting early and resubmitting if you do changes, and do the fine-tuning in the end, just to be on the safe side. That's a picture taken from this submission part. It's basically part of this, what I call Part A of the proposal. So Part A is all these things that you fill in online. It's about, you know, the acronym of the proposal, the title, an abstract, and other information. And then the Part B is really the template that you saw before, that the proposal itself is the Part B. So most of the information is the Part B, but Part A is important too. Maybe I should have started with this, but what can we as NCPs, as national contact points, do for you? So, well, obviously we organize events like this, but really our job is to help you and of course the host as well, throughout the submission process, because it can be challenging, can be complicated. We are aware of this, and you might not be used to it, so we are there to help you. I have to stress that we as Luxembourgish NCPs are in charge of people coming to Luxembourg, or Luxembourgish hosting people. If you are based in Luxembourg currently and your plan is to do Marie Curie outside of Luxembourg, you need to contact the NCP from that country, right? Just as a side note. I mean, you can always try and contact us, but there's really no guarantee that we will be able to help you. So we try to answer legal, technical, administrative questions regarding the budget, regarding your eligibility, but then also the content. You know, we will not be able to discuss the science because we are not experts in every field. I personally, I come from a research background, but my research is in cancer research and life science. So certainly I cannot give you scientific feedback on particle physics and mathematics and all these things. But we are really there to help you review your proposals and help you get a clear narrative, help you clearly formulate your thoughts and your actions, because that's really the most important thing that we see each year. The proposals that see not a very good score, they are written in a way that makes them not very clear. So you manage to convey what you actually want to do and why you want to do it. What is the big question? And this is really something we'll discuss in the next webinar in more detail. But that's the most, the major part where we intervene as NCPs in the proposals. And again, we submit your proposals to us as early as possible if you want. You don't have to at all. I guess every year we receive around maybe 50% of all proposals that are being submitted from Luxembourg. But as a side note, so if we only look at last year, the proposals that we did review were about twice as likely of being funded than the ones that we didn't review. So they had around a success rate of around 40%, which is extremely high. Maybe it was just a statistical anomaly, and I'm certainly not putting this all back to my colleagues' skills, but it is part of it, and it can help you. Not in all cases, but in some cases. And it especially can help you if you send us your documents early. And I want to stress here, so unfortunately I have to give a sort of a firm deadline. So I know the deadline for submission is September 9th, but we most likely will not be able to give you any feedback on your documents or questions if you submit them after August 24th. I know that can be very stressful. There's still plenty of time to be prepared, but unfortunately we are humans too, and we take our holidays during the same time than everybody else does. I know the Commission might not care with the deadlines about this. On the other hand, many candidates do benefit from this summer break to do most of the writing. But just to leave this, to take this into account, that submit early, maybe we'll be able to even give you comments on several rounds. But again, I said it before and I will repeat it again, please read this NCP handbook, this Net for Mobility handbook that I mentioned before, and follow the structure, because from my experience from the last 2 years, 90% of my comments on the first drafts that I receive is, please go back and have a look at this handbook and apply what is written there. It helps you write the correct things in the correct places mostly. That's the important thing. And that helps me do an efficient review, because if I have to scroll through the entire proposal to find the information, even if it's there somewhere and it's difficult to find, it takes a lot of time for me to give you feedback on it, to understand what you want to achieve. And it will be deadly for if the reviewer is in the same situation and cannot find the information he expects, because he might be more stressed than I am. Other remarks, and we are getting towards the end of this session. So part-time projects are possible since a few years. They are not specifically mentioned in the proposal, and you shouldn't mention them in your text either. Let's imagine you want to do 50% only project, meaning your project will take, instead of 2 years, it will take 4 years, but you will only be working 50% of the time because of family reasons, because of you want to start a company, do some other work, do some other training on the side. That's possible. But the Commission asks you to not mention this in the proposal in order to not influence the decision-making of the evaluators, mostly in a negative way, because they might think, oh, this person has a family, or he's not dedicated enough, or he wants to do a company, he doesn't care about the science enough. No, that's not how it should be. So what happens is you discuss this with, obviously you discuss this with your host, because they need to be in agreement. And then once your proposal is granted, so you are funded, you will discuss this with the European Commission, and in general they have no objections. Of course, this is not to say that you want to do a 5% fellowship and spend 10 years on it. It's really, I think the minimum is around 50% or so. But it can give you a bit more flexibility, which can be interesting. There's also special needs allowance. This is for people that have, well, as the name says, special needs, maybe a disability that requires them to need specific equipment, or it's mostly that, or do some changes, or it makes them more difficult to find a place to live. And this can be a whole variety of special needs that are not really defined. So if you can make an argument there, you can discuss this with us. and we can see if you can apply for this in a separate way. This is then a lump sum, an amount of money that you can ask for that can or cannot be granted depending on each case. And it's not meant to, you cannot say, well, I want to live in a fancy apartment, so I need more money. That's not the reason, right? So it really comes down to special needs, and you can Google what that means if you need help with that. Another point that you may or may not want to discuss with your host is if they are willing or interested to cover costs of trainings or consultants in preparation of the proposal. I know some of them do, some of them don't. Obviously, I understand the reasons why not every host can pay for, even if they're minor costs, but costs for consultants in preparing the proposal. It's certainly not necessary, but it helps. We see the effect in past proposals. It doesn't help in every case, especially if you have already an excellent proposal and a candidate that has excellent writing skills. There's really no need, no added value. But in other cases, there is a value. Of course, there are also, let's say, try not to be too pejorative, but there are also hopeless cases of people that even with the help of a consultant would not be able to get a fellowship. But I trust your host that did a selection process to really select you to be very competitive for candidates for this. So these consultants, they can help you. They will not write a proposal for you, and that's very clear. But they might be able to help you in a more personal way than I will be able to help you. Because you can imagine probably this year in Luxembourg we'll submit some 50, 60, 70 proposals. I'm one person, and it's not the only task, this Marie Curie project that I have. I follow other tasks as well. So you can imagine that I will not be able, especially in the last week of August, to give detailed feedback for all of these. But a consultant is being paid for this, right? And so there are consultants that really take the time to discuss this one-on-one. As I said, I don't want to do too much advertisement for this. That's really not our job. If you want, we can provide you a list of these. And I try to be as open and neutral as I can. It's, as I said, I repeat again, it's not mandatory, but it can help. It can do the small incremental percentage point that you needed to succeed or not, depending on the case, right? But just to put it out there. So finally, questions. Please, if you have any questions about this seminar, I see that some of them already wrote some questions. I think the best thing is, since we are just about in the 1 hour that we defined, and I know everybody has a busy schedule, I'll take the time and answer these questions during the next webinar. So this way, maybe some questions of you were very similar, so I can give one answer instead of giving 5. But of course, you can also send them in online through my email. In some cases, your questions, you might not want to discuss them openly because they're private or very specific for your situation. So that's no problem. Just indicate it to me, and I'll be happy to help you get them answered. So that's it really from my side for this first part. So part 2 will deal with next week. I hope you had a good time. I hope I could teach most of you some new things. I mostly hope I could raise a lot of questions that you might have and send in, as I said, either through the tool or through the email. Will you all get the slides and the recording as soon as possible based on the email addresses that you registered now? And then that might help you again formulate some questions. Please read also these documents that I put in the links because they already give you lots of answers. There's also a thing called the Marie Curie Frequently Asked Questions blog, And if you cannot find it, if by Googling exactly these words, contact me and I can send you the link. It can be very technical, and you might not be able to find the questions that you want, but almost 90%, I would say, of the questions that you will ask and that anybody can ask have already been asked and have already been answered and can be found on this website. But again, I'm here to help you. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your questions, which I will read in the next weeks or days, basically. And I hope you all. I hope to see you all again next week. So thank you very much.